Welcome, Rochester. My name is Wafal Khalifa, and I work for Destination Medical Center as the Equitable Development Coordinator. I'm here with my colleague, Chow Matala, and she serves City of Rochester as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director. We welcome you to the July episode of the Equity Series. And I want to take a few moments here to remind everyone of where you can find the previous episodes of the Equity Series. And I also want to acknowledge that it has been already a year since we launched Equity Series. So happy anniversary to the Equity Alliance Equity Series. We have 12 episodes of different topics, different information and tools that we wanted to make sure that you and your organizations are aware of in order to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in order to grow a more vibrant community in Rochester. We would love to know, how are you utilizing these episodes? Have you been sharing them with your colleagues at work? Are you utilizing the episodes as a professional development tool? I think Chow and I will talk about how can we maybe create some sort of a survey or a document to learn more about what you think of the episodes, what you think of the series, and how can we improve it. And if you have any ideas about any other topics that we could include for the next couple months. But please visit our YouTube channel, the Destination Medical Center YouTube channel. And as you can see here on the screen, this is the folder, the Equity Alliance Equity Series. I would love for you to take a look at the previous episodes and let us know. And for any information that you're looking for about the Equity Alliance and how can your organization join this effort, feel free to contact me or contact Chow Matala. We'll be more than happy to sit with you and your organization, your leaders, to explain what is the Equity Alliance and what we're trying to achieve here. I know that in our community, there's so many efforts that we encourage and we support, whether the DEI practitioners group, and several other efforts and collaborations. And the Equity Alliance is no different from the other collaborations in terms of creating a space for partnership, but our work focuses mainly on improving your organizations, and how can you make equitable changes within your organization so we can achieve better results in the community. Now, for the July episode, as I've shared in the press release, our topic today, it's going to be how organizations can commit to accessibility. And it's going to be presented to you today by Jacob Metz, and Jacob is the Equity Fellow for City of Rochester. But before I pass it to Jacob, when we think of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's often associated with race. And from race, it's often associated with Black or white. But diversity includes a lot of other demographics, a lot of other groups of underserved, underrepresented communities. And what we're looking to touch on today through Jacob's presentation is how can we make our community and organizations more accessible, and a way to share some information, since this month is the Disability Pride Month as well. So I'll pass it to Jacob. Welcome to the Equity Series, and thank you for being with us today.
So much for that. And let me share my screen. Is everyone able to see that? Okay. So if anyone needs any, like, either isn't able to, there's an issue with how it appears or the audio, please just put it in the chat, and Chow or Wafal will let me know. But to start out with this, before anything else, I'm going to start out with something called an access check, which is something that I've seen some other people over virtual meetings do. And all that is, for people who might not know, is just a visual description of what it looks like in your little box. So my name is Jacob. I'm younger. I'm white. I'm a man. I have short brown hair. I have a blurred background, and I'm currently wearing a pink button down. So that's something I've seen some other people do as a best practice. So we may as well model it here too. But for today, I'm talking about how organizations can commit to accessibility. And to just go over what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to give an introduction about myself and a little bit of an overview about what my work is and what I've learned about all these topics, disability rights history, so to really go into more of what that movement has looked like, as well as disability justice, principles, and language. So a very integral part to understand what has that history led to right now, and what is some of the language that people with disabilities themselves, self-advocates, and activists use and consistently try to surface, either about themselves or the broader community. And then the last one is what organizations can do. So to start out with just a little bit about me, this is a picture of my niece's baptism. I have my dad on my left, me, my mom, my brother holding my niece Jordan, and I'm never going to miss an opportunity to talk about Jordan. And then my sister-in-law Amanda on the far right. So I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and I went to undergrad in WashU in St. Louis, where I worked for the deputy mayor of racial equity priority initiatives in St. Louis. So right after the Ferguson uprising and the protests in 2014, the mayor's office for the first time ever took a step to actually hire someone to focus on racial equity and oversee those broader coordination of different efforts related to things recommended by the Ferguson Commission and recommendations from them. So that has been a really instrumental moment for me to realize that local government and governments in general can do a lot of good and can do a lot of harm. And that's why it's never just automatically going to, the arc of history isn't always going to bend towards justice. It always takes all of us consistently being part of it to ask ourselves to be better and to make sure that people in power are committing resources in that way to make sure that it's moving in a direction that's best for community. And I'm here with the City of Rochester. I work for CHOW as part of the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. I graduated with my master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm celebrating, actually, I think my 1-year anniversary today, now that I think about it. So it's pretty remarkable. It's been a whole year, and I have 1 more year after that. But one of the other things I really wanted to say before going into this is to say, I am not a person with a disability, and I do not have that lived experience. I'm new to this work, and I'm learning a lot more about this history, these concepts, and how they show up for people. So the experts with this are always going to be the one with lived experiences themselves. So everything contained within this presentation is from them, conversations I've had with them, or anything I have read they've written. And I think that it's really important to say that up front, because I think that allies like myself can and should educate themselves on their own time, and that the responsibility for that education and the responsibility to show up in any of these spaces cannot always fall on impacted people to just do that work. It has to be a collective effort. And my way of engaging with anything with equity work is almost always as an ally. And I think that we should try, as people who care about this deeply and as people who are part of this work, that's where our role can be, is educating ourselves and doing our best to speak up as well. So without further ado, I'll go into it. This is a little bit of what my scope of work is, focusing on how the City of Rochester can best serve and work with community members with disabilities, and how we can serve and work with community members with limited English proficiency. So they go hand in hand, and I'm always open to talking no matter what about either of these things. So please reach out if you have any ideas, or if you just want to chat. But to go into it first about disability rights history, I'm going to cover some key moments in the US disability rights movement. I think that through conversations with people who are in social justice spaces, I'm not sure if disability is always foregrounded, uplifted, if the basic tenets of that movement and that history are really internalized for a lot of different people who don't have that lived experience. So I wanted to start with that first and start with highlighting something called the independent living movement. So throughout the history of the US, one of the things that consistently people with disabilities had faced is something called institutionalization. And that was effectively a effort to commit quote unquote people to different medical centers and to keep them separate, to keep them effectively segregated from the rest of the population. And as a disclaimer before all this, this is more upsetting information, just to put that out there first, but that is what really spurred something within the 60s and 70s called the independent living movement to challenge the idea that people with disabilities would need to be institutionalized in jails or poorhouses or facilities that would control patients and not actually listen to their own needs. And the basic premise of that movement was that people with disabilities don't have to be dependent on parents and professionals, but they themselves are the best experts on their own needs and what that looks like, and that it is up to society as a whole to build the supports necessary so that people with disabilities can thrive no matter what their needs are, and that it's up to us to try to remove any specific barriers that prevent people from actually accomplishing that task and living a fulfilled life within the community in whatever way that they need, in whatever way that they want. So 3 specific names to highlight, to uplift that people should look into that are big parts of the independent living movement are Johnny Lacey, who was a Black woman in Berkeley who was instrumental in forming one of the first centers for independent living in Berkeley, California. And Judy Human, the second one there, if I'm pronouncing that last name right, she also is someone who has been, was an activist extensively over time, both in her home, over numerous different issues with litigation, and then also with the independent living movement. And then, so she's referred to in some ways as the mother of the independent living movement. And then Ed Roberts, who is typically referred to as the father of the independent living movement, someone who had fought to actually establish a center for independent living. And then that as a movement, as part of that broader movement, spread across the country. And there are centers for independent living throughout the country, including here in Rochester. And then one of the next moments I wanted to highlight was something called the 504 sit-in. So I'll go into the specifics of that on the next slide in terms of some legislation, but a key federal law that was passed in 1973 is called the Rehabilitation Act. And it was a watershed moment in the movement for civil rights for people with disabilities. And the reason why, or one of the main reasons why, was Section 504, is that it prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in any federally funded program or federally funded facility. But as we've seen with any other law and its implementation, with any other historically marginalized group, there was a very notable gap between when that legislation passed and when it was an actual felt reality for people in their everyday lives. And to that end, it took several years before there was any regulations that were issued to actually clarify, here's how we would bring this to life for people. So as a result, and that's the black and white picture you can see on your left, people with disabilities took it upon themselves to pressure the federal government to issue those regulations, make them clear, and actually dictate what federally funded programs could look like, what federally funded facilities could look like in terms of access to them. And that's something that is a clear moment within disability rights and within the broader civil rights movement for people with disabilities in the US. And then the last one that I wanted to highlight there is something called the Capitol Crawl. And that was related to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in the early 90s in July, actually, which is why Disability Pride Month is in the month of July. And it was, even though it passed with a bipartisan majority in the Senate, it was stuck in House committees and was tied up in House committees for a long time. So as a result, there was a broad movement to go to the US Capitol itself, and for people with physical disabilities to climb up each of the 83 steps. to make a very clear symbolic point of, this is what it takes to be able to make anyone in power and any Congress person or senator to listen to us and to take this seriously, but also the nature that there were steps there and no other accommodation, no other ramps. Also, we're supposed to call to attention the idea that it really matters to have a law that requires not just the federal government, but state and local governments, restaurants, businesses, any other place of private accommodation to also have those accommodations in the physical built environment for people with disabilities and within programs. And that's why the ADA was so massive and so important even until today, because those requirements I talked about earlier with the Rehabilitation Act that just applied to the federal government, they were expanded with the passage of the ADA. So that's one of the reasons that that's one of the key critical moments within the disability rights movement. So the key legislation related to that would be the Rehabilitation Act, as I had talked about, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA Act, which I know a lot of our folks in Rochester Public Schools or community members would be all too familiar with. And to be very clear how these movements for collective liberation often intersect, the decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, that Supreme Court case declaring that any U.S. state law that allowed for segregated facilities, segregated public education, like it knocked it down or reversed it, reversed separate but equal. That is the exact same doctrine that a lot of disability rights activists themselves point to as allowing for the IDEA Act. So these are movements that intersect and are really important and intertwined together, again, for a broader collective liberation. And then I wanted to point out the specific titles of the ADA on the off chance that people maybe didn't know. So it would prevent employment discrimination against people with disabilities. Title II, which is fair and equal access to state and local government facilities and services. That's what we at the City of Rochester are consistently trying to do our best to make sure that we're meeting that at the highest quality way possible. And where we're not, and we're not measuring up, figuring out what it will take to get there and to do so as expediently as possible. Title III, barring discrimination in public accommodations and commercial facilities, so like hotels or restaurants or private businesses. So again, this coverage applies to them too, not just governments. And then Title IV, so governing telecommunications, which already I think as a word is kind of dated from the early 90s, but it is something that can still very much apply to how we have to ensure that our websites are as accessible as possible, or that anything that appears on an app is as accessible as possible. So some other things that I want to throw out there, because maybe people are familiar with it or can see it. Some of the changes that are brought about by the ADA can be things like ramps and braille signs, emotional support animals for people, sign language interpreters at political rallies or sporting events or any large public event like that. Electronic listening devices in movie theaters. For instance, I went to the movies a couple weeks ago and there was closed captioning on one of the movies. So offering that more and more as an option for people is it has its roots within the ADA in terms of that requirement for public accommodations or private businesses, and then reasonable accommodations. So, which is a legal term, which is why I put it in quotes, by employers like flex time or telecommuting. A lot of its roots come from the ADA. So to go into the next thing in terms of disability justice principles and language, I wanted again to really lay the groundwork for what that looks like, not only from the key moments of the history that we just covered, but also how that shows up today. And what are some of the language that we should be mindful of that we use today. So these are some key principles from a group called Sins Invalid. I would highly recommend anyone to take a look and to visit them. They have 10 different principles, but because I want to be as mindful of time as I can be, I wanted to pick out some of the main ones that I thought I really wanted to highlight. One of those is leadership of those most impacted. I think that this is something that's a best practice for really any specific movement, any specific civil rights movement, any social justice movement, is ensuring that the people with the lived experiences are actually the ones who people listen to, people will follow, and people will adopt. That those are the perspectives that should guide people. So in this case, ensuring that anything that we do on accessibility or anything that we do on disability is taking our cue from people with disabilities themselves, from what they say these systems are doing, from what they say the impacts of the systems are. The next thing is recognizing wholeness. So making sure that we realize that people have worth outside of just and specific worth outside of just the relations of like a transaction or any idea of like productivity or anything like that. Rejecting the idea that someone's worth is solely wrapped up in what they can do or what they can produce, and realize that that's not the kind of thinking that we should be subscribing to. We, in fact, should reject it. And that's something that I think is a principle that is true in general, both in this movement and also in general when we treat each other and when we think about each other. And then the last one is thinking about cross-disability solidarity. So realizing that there are a whole range of disabilities. No two disabilities are alike. No two people with the same disability will have the same lived experience, which is another thing that I think is really important for people to keep in mind. And that anything that focuses on this broader collective liberation, anything that focuses on trying to make systems, organizations as accessible as possible, has to keep that in mind and has to be mindful of all these different disabilities that show up for people, so that we're making sure that we're meeting people's needs. The next thing is disability justice framework from Sins and Ballots. So again, want to leave this up, that this is from a framework that was adapted by a person named Patty Byrne. They are a disability justice organizer, and then they're co-founder of Sins and Ballot. So just to put that out there, all bodies are unique and essential. So again, recognizing wholeness. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. So realizing that everyone has access needs, and that realizing that and getting in the frame of mind to recognize that, I think is really important when we think about these topics. Something that she wrote in regards to herself and people with disabilities is, we are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. That grants people a certain power and a certain strength that needs to be recognized, appreciated, and uplifted. And then similarly, that last one, that all bodies of all abilities are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation state, and religion and more, and that you can't separate them. So I imagine that that's something that would be hopefully a more familiar topic for people in terms of just the intersectionality of things, that any number of identities that you have affect how you show up in a space. And that is, as Wafad said, when we think about DEI work, so often it is related to race and racial justice, which is extremely important and should be something that is a focus of ours. But something with accessibility can affect how someone shows up in that space, regardless of their racial identity, and vice versa. So having the grace to recognize that and realize that there are different ways that people will take up space depending upon those identities and how those identities intersect. This is the next thing, are these different models of disability that I think are really important to uplift. If people don't recognize what they are, hopefully we'll be able to make it a little bit more specific. But there are two broad models of disability that frequently come up in the movement and literature that I've heard from people, which is the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. So the medical model is a way of thinking and a way of treating people, and also reflective of our policies, that shows that disability results from a person's physical or mental limitations, and it's not connected to their environments. And this is a problematic way of approaching things. It's a problematic way of thinking of things, because it does treat people as if they're problems to be managed or they're problems to be fixed. And inherent within that assumption is the idea that there is something wrong with disability. And that is what leads, or with a person's disability. And the flip side of this coin, with the medical model of disability, which the independent living movement was moving away from, which I think all of us should do our best to move away from, is the social model of disability, realizing that disability actually does not result from anything that's specifically medical or something that's specific to the person. It in fact results from the social barriers that we create that affect people and their ability to meaningfully participate fully in home and community life. And that, if anything, this shows up both within the built environment and what that looks like, and decisions that people who are behind that construction and behind those plans made, and who they were thinking of when they made those plans and conducted that construction, but it's also true in our mental attitudes. It's true in our language, which is something we'll cover in a second. So to make that a little bit more concrete, I have these two examples from the University of California, San Francisco. So the first one is thinking about it in a way that I think people may typically think about disability when they think about a physical disability in regards to a barrier like the one that you see in the picture on the right, where you see two steps before you can enter the door to like a cafe or a restaurant. So the scenario is a woman using a wheelchair is excited to meet her date at a trendy new restaurant located inside of an older historic building. However, two steps prevent her from entering the restaurant. So that's a situation. People who think about it from the medical model mindset would say, well, the reason that this is an issue is it's her inability. She can't walk up the steps, and that's what prevented her from entering the restaurant. And instead, what disability justice activists advocate, what self-advocates argue, and what I'm saying is we really should be leaning into the social model part of that to say, no, it has nothing to do with anything related to her ability. It's how it was constructed in the first place. It's the absence of a ramp that prevented her entrance. It limited the access of families with infants and strollers and delivery people using wheeled carts. So again, thinking about this in terms of universal design, that if we had a paradigm shift, if we shifted how we approach these things and thought about these things as the conditions that allow for people to think that something is a disability and therefore on the person, if we shifted that, it's something that could benefit everyone, regardless of whether they had something that's recognized now as a disability or not. It could help the parents with infants and strollers, or it could help people who are delivering large packages. And then the second example, so similarly sticking with this, is perceived intellectual abilities versus employment accommodations. So I just have a stock photo of some glasses on a journal to the right. And the whole idea is a man with an intellectual disability applies for employment at a retail store. And when it comes to actually ensuring that that man is set up for success in the workplace, the medical model may say, well, the learning deficits are perceived to prevent him from performing the duties of this job. So why hire him? Like the application is rejected. That's again reminiscent of what that mindset does when that's how you treat people with disabilities. When instead the social model would say, we can recognize the many strengths that this person has, that the disability isn't a limitation, but also a strength, right? We can recognize, as what's written there, that anyone who helps them, like a job coach, can help this man successfully perform essential job duties, but can also identify opportunities to increase their efficiency, what they do, to help supervisors and managers be free from basic tasks. Like there are any number of ways that we can meaningfully integrate people with disabilities into our organizations and our systems, and it's up to us as well, if that's not something that's been thought of. It's up to people in these organizations to ensure that we're creating the most accessible and inclusive environments possible. So in terms of the language part, this is something that I took both from a disability summit that I attended at the City of Madison, as well as some best practices that were summarized in a way that I thought effectively gave voice to what I've heard people say from the National Education Association, are just some do's and don'ts for people who may not know. So the do's in terms of how you would actually talk with someone with a disability is it's almost always a good idea to use people first language or identity first language. So the idea, and always deferring to what that person prefers in terms of how they want to be called, how they want to be addressed, if it's even something that comes up at all. So for instance, people first language would be something like a person with autism versus identity first language, which is an autistic person. And again, it would refer to, or everyone should refer to, how someone calls themselves and use that as the basic template. One of the other do's is treating a person with a disability as an independent person with their own agency. So one of the ways that I think that this comes up, that I've seen this come up in grad school, I see it come up all the time, is if someone is using a sign language interpreter and you're having a conversation and you don't know ASL or sign language, and you are just speaking to that person, often people will speak to the interpreter and not the person's interpreter, even though you're having the conversation with the person and not their sign language interpreter, which is actually a best practice, I think also holds true for language access, that if you don't speak the same language, a basic measure of respect is making eye contact and speaking directly to the person who you're actually having a conversation with, not the person who's helping to interpret. And in terms of some things to avoid, is something that I think people will do is they'll use euphemisms to like beat around the bush when they refer to someone, like calling someone challenged, whether it's like physically challenged or mentally challenged. And this is something I've heard from people again and again as something that is patronizing, that people believe is patronizing, that there's really no reason to use that kind of language as opposed to doing something that, like I said in that other column, is referring to it in the way that they themselves refer to it, to their disability. There's no reason to use a euphemism like that. And then one of the other things I really wanted to cover is ableist language itself that treats disability as something to be pitied or treats disabled people as inspirational for overcoming difficulties. This is something I've heard, I think, across the board, 100%, in terms of how we actually treat people. And I believe that it is a clear manifestation of the medical model of disability in terms of how it affects people's thinking. Instead of it treating someone as if they're inspirational or anything like that for overcoming their difficulties, or overcoming difficulties, right? Really, it should be a focus on just treating them respectfully and treating them normally. And it's something that, you know, a lot of us may have learned when we were a lot younger, but it really does hold true that treat people how you want to be treated. And you certainly wouldn't want to be treated in a way that's patronizing or anything like that, just treated one-to-one, whether you're talking to someone who is a child or an adult, like treat them as a fellow adult. And so that's something that I really wanted to surface and uplift, because that's something I hear quite a lot about. And I think that that's important coverage, and that's important an important groundwork before we go into what organizations can do. So as a quick overview of this, I think that these are some of the main things that organizations can do on accessibility, and that I would call upon anyone on this call, anyone who watches this video, to try to initiate these conversations within your own organization. Disability awareness, accessible communication formats, making accommodation procedures and processes clear for employees and the public, whether that's your customers or whether you serve a community in that way, emergency preparation plans, digital accessibility, and the built environment. And before going into all these, one thing that I want to make clear is all of this has come from talking with disability coordinators in other cities, talking with self-advocates in other cities and here. And I think that there's this presumption that accessibility is something that if you're going to commit to it, the immediate barrier that people who maybe are new to these topics cite is cost, and a fear about cost and longevity of different projects, and the idea that it's something that's mainly physical. It's mainly physical barriers that you would want to mitigate, and that's what people are calling on. And what I really want to impress upon people is that that is not the only way to make your organizations more accessible. That is not the only way to commit to accessibility in a meaningful way. That all these different things, I genuinely, truly believe can be done on far shorter timescales, and I think can make a very notable difference in people's lives. And that's why I wanted to uplift this as something that matters. And I don't have a slide specifically for disability awareness, because I think that that was sort of the whole brunt of the presentation before this, is to say that learning about the language, if people aren't all that familiar with the topic or the history, and learning about the history is something that is critical. I actually think that that might be one of the things I hear again and again from people, is that that is something that people really wish that more people took the responsibility to educate themselves and to learn about these topics, so that we can be more conversant in them and that we can make better decisions together. And I think that's one of the things that disability awareness does, is it asks all of us to begin to ask the question, how is what our organization does affect someone with a physical disability or a visual disability or a cognitive disability? It is my impression, I know that I'm a youngin and I've only been here a year, but it is my impression that a lot of people aren't always asking those questions, whether it is something that is within the city of Rochester. I firmly believe that here, or whether that is true in other organizations. I don't think that that's always asked. And I think it is on all of us to really push those conversations and to ask that. So, and I think that starts with the awareness part of it. But to go into some of the other pieces, for accessible communication formats, I wanted to highlight a number of different formats and explain what I mean. So in anything like how someone will reach you, how you will reach community members. Having those messages, having those communications available in a whole number of formats, or having a process ready for if someone reaches out to you and requires one of these formats is something I think would be a good best practice, as well as letting the public know that you serve, again, whether it's a nonprofit or a private business or something like that, that this is something that you'll do and that this is something you care about. I think making that clear and making it transparent that that's something an organization does is critical. So some of the things that I put there, a TTY or TDD, for people that don't know, a TTY stands for a teletypewriter. A TDD stands for a telecommunications device for the deaf. So again, if people don't know, if you typically see for businesses, either like on the side of a bus or on a website, here's the phone number, and then if you see another one that's underneath that is right after TTY or TDD, it's a specific system that people will use if they have a speech disability. So another way to be able to reach someone is having this device available on your end. So if they call that number for that device, you'll be able to communicate back and forth with them. But another thing that is possible that I would tell everyone about right now is dialing 711, which is what reaches something called the Minnesota Relay Service, which is also a free service. It's a free number that it's a workaround. So it isn't necessarily one-to-one, but just for people to know, that's an option. Braille, as I think more and more people probably know, to help people with visual disability. Captions or subtitles. I think that on any video that people have on social media, any video that people have on their website, for meetings, for anything like that, it makes sense to have captions or to have some sort of subtitles that are there. And I actually think, similar to what we said earlier about that social model of disability and having people realize that it benefits a whole number of people if you actually add a ramp and not stairs, the same holds true here. Your engagement with a post on something with social media will likely boost, and research shows that it does boost if they have captions. And so it not only helps someone who needs it, who may need it because they wouldn't otherwise be able to engage with that content in a meaningful way, but it's something that can benefit people above and beyond that. Similarly, knowing and having things available in audio format or large print, and just knowing that asking that question about what is our plan if someone is asking for this sort of accommodation, or having a plan ready to be able to talk about, to be able to have these formats when they're actually delivered and to community, whether it's an advertisement or something like that, is I think a very meaningful thing that people can do. And I don't think it takes a lot of time to do it. There are some costs associated with some of these things, but it is not a heavy lift. And I think committing to this and letting the public know that this is something that you do will go a long way. So this is one of the first things I would suggest and I would talk about. The second one is a reasonable accommodation. So how do you make sure that processes are clear for employees to request an accommodation, your own, or how are the processes clear for prospective employees? So if someone wants to apply for a job, but may need an accommodation to participate in the interview or something like that. And then also for the public. So here I made a shameless plug for our reasonable accommodation procedure here at the City of Rochester, which you can find out our website, the About page, DEI, and then accessibility. And this is a requirement of the ADA. So to be transparent and bring it back to us at the city, this is something that we are legally required to do. It is every person's right under the Americans with Disabilities Act to ask for that accommodation. And I know that it can be difficult to fulfill some of these depending upon turnaround times, depending upon events. I won't say that it's not. I know that it can be a strain for organizations with a lot of resources to say maybe none whatsoever. But I do think it's something that we should commit to. One, we have to legally, and two, it's something that matters. It's something that can allow people to meaningfully and fully be part of a community or an event. So examples of what that looks like, if people were wondering what that is, are in that screenshot of the form on the right. So something like a sign language interpreter or special seating in events, knowing and having a plan for wheelchair mobility access. Communication access real-time translation, or CART, is another system that ultimately is another way that you can provide effectively real-time captions for folks, material in Braille or large print material. So this is something I think is a really important thing that people should know about and commit to. And I think that this goes, frankly, for any business, regardless of whether you have extensive public interaction or not. Recall earlier that there are movie theaters that will put subtitles in certain movies, or at the Mayo Civic Center, or at when you're going to the theater for a play or anything like that, you can get an assistive listening device. That's a good example of what this can look like, and something I would really encourage everyone on the call and everyone who will watch this call to commit to and figure out a plan for that for their organization if they don't have one already. One of the other ones is emergency preparation plans. So if, depending upon what actually happens, if there's a fire, if there's a flood, if there's any number of other emergency situations, what is the plan for your business, for your nonprofit, for your organization to communicate in those events when they happen, to ensure that people are safely evacuated out of your buildings or your facilities? This is something that of course, no one thinks about it until it happens, and then it's a oh God moment about what to do. So this is yet another thing that I think would be really clear if this was made clear to both your staff, and if this was made clear to the public where appropriate, depending upon the nature of your organization, to say, here's what we would do. So to be clear on that, like for contact information, this may already be true for different employers and their employees, but communicating to personnel like the need of, here's why it's important to update your contact information, or for people in a confidential format with their employer to self-identify needs or to discuss a personal evacuation plan so that there's some sort of plan already in place. Similarly, for if someone has a need for special, or is self-identified their need for assistance, and they need like emergency coordinators to discuss those logistics, having that planned to know what are those needs, what is needed to best fulfill those needs, and what is the way to make sure that someone is safe within that situation. Similarly, in areas of refuge, as I have put there, identify and become familiar with what those locations are, whether that's designated stairwells where someone who uses a wheelchair can wait for assistance during an emergency. And then also like alternative communication methods, similar to what I was saying on the last slide. What would you do if someone is blind or low vision, whether it's an employee or whether it's someone who you serve? What would be the plan to be able to communicate information to that person? That's something that I think is really important for every organization to take upon themselves to ask that question. And again, I'm going to keep banging that drum to say that each of these things, I really don't think are heavy lifts. I think that they're things that would go a long way. My impression for anything in the DEI space or equity space is that people are always, very understandably, looking at it as generations long work, and it is. And I really don't want to undersell that or say that it's not, but there absolutely are certain things that people can do right now that would make a difference, and that would not only make programs and organizations more accessible, but it also would send a pretty notable signal to this community that that's something that your organization cares about, and that you care about people like them. And so that's one of the main reasons that I'm pushing this so hard. This is digital accessibility. So another way that we're thinking about this, and WCAG guidelines, which stand for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so making sure that community members with disabilities can easily navigate your website and your content. So I have two screenshots here. One is from a group called Userway. That is a web accessibility tool that you could subscribe to for a rate for each year. And it's an example of a tool. There are many others, but a tool that people could use that could affect what the content looks like on your website to best meet their needs. So there, to just go a little bit more into that, if someone doesn't have a screen reader, having something that can actually read the text to them, or voice navigation, or affect the color contrast in the top right there, or it can even affect something like text spacing or make text more dyslexia friendly. All different ways that people can start to take that a lot more seriously, and something that would, I think, be a very meaningful investment. And then on the right is an accessibility checker through Microsoft PowerPoint, which if you have Microsoft PowerPoint, you almost certainly have that accessibility checker. And I put that there also as a measure of transparency. For when I was putting together this presentation, this checker was able to identify all those different results for what I had missed, for when I was quickly putting it together. I promise I did want to put alt text on images and I was circling back to it, but this checker was a really good way of saying, here's what you missed. And it's something that's free, and something like that on PowerPoint or on other products through the Microsoft suite is something that is free and something that you can use now, and I think should use now. So to go into that a little bit more for what that says, alt text on images, if people aren't familiar with that, is a way for users with screen readers to be able to successfully and meaningfully navigate a website. So if there are pictures that are instrumental, or really even if they're not, like with the text, they can still be something that would really enhance someone's understanding of the content on that page. So an alt text is something that's like a quick 1 to 2 sentence description of what that image actually is. So that's why for each and every single image on this PowerPoint, I put in like a 1 to 2 sentence description if this was actually going to be shared and if people were going to see that. So if someone was using a screen reader, they'd be able to tell that. Similarly, for check reading order under the warning sign that's right there, that there's a way where depending on each text box or anything like that on Microsoft PowerPoint, it effectively dictates, here's what I would want a screen reader to read first. So for instance, on this slide, I wouldn't want it to read that box that says other things to note first. I would want it to read the title slide first, or the title at the very top, Digital Accessibility and WCAG Guidelines. So the reading order is what affects that. And then the hard to read text contrast has to do with the actual colors. So that's something that I would really recommend that people consider seriously. And again, this is a very easy way and easy tool to at least start to make sure that the content that you're putting out there or that you're sharing is more accessible and accessible friendly. And one of the things I think helps with both language access and accessibility, and just in general for communications, is putting things in plain language. So there are any number of ways to be able to do that. And I think that government is arguably maybe one of the guiltiest organizations of that possible when we talk about laws and you have no idea what someone's saying, no idea what someone's referring to because the language is just so dang hard to actually be able to comprehend. Putting that in plain language is something that is I think would demonstrate a clear commitment to equity. So that's another reason that I really want to lift that up as well. And then, of course, the built environment. So I know that this is something that people would talk about a lot, and very rightfully so, in terms of different things related to what businesses do, or how you can access that business, how you can go to that business. Some of these things would take more time, depending upon if it is a historic building, or depending upon the nature of where your organization is. I wouldn't want to be glib about that, but I would want to include this as something that does really matter for how an organization can commit to accessibility. So for something like parking, how many spaces are there? How many accessible spaces are there if there's parking near you? How wide are the aisles? So I know that some of these things are already connected or should be connected to the accessibility code, or something that our building inspectors should be able to inspect over time, or should be able to help walk you through what that can look like. The path of travel. So to me, this would mean, yes, are there ramps and are there curb cuts and how long are those ramps? But even if you were to put for certain events, the nearest bus stop to where that event is, and making sure that the address is clear, being open about what how long it would take to actually get there, that can be something that could be really helpful for someone, just to make it really clear, like for instance, the bus line, the bus stop, and like an estimated amount of time, because we all want people to show up to these different events that we're hosting, right? Or to our organizations to drive that kind of traffic. So I would really recommend that people think about that. The entrance to doors. So I think this is something that people are far more familiar with, thinking about, are all doors clear with accessible entrances? What does this actually look like? Is it difficult for a senior person with a disability to open? Is something that I think really matters. And I'll finish this slide and I'll get to your question, John. And then similarly, the same deal with elevators and common areas and public restrooms and drinking fountains as well. And these are things that that hopefully the accessibility code are able to impress upon people initially when they're actually starting things and starting construction. But I know it can be a problem when it comes to trying to alter spaces as they exist now, or if they existed before that accessibility code. And that is something that is a particular policy challenge and disincentive that all of us are going to have to respond to. So actually, if it's okay with you, John, I just have 2 more slides and then I'll jump to your question. So in terms of just what other cities can do is just something I really want to uplift is there's the in Boise, Idaho, a cross disability task force. So that's something that the city government put together of people with disabilities of different types of disabilities to be able to show this is what we like these are the sorts of things that we want to prioritize. One of which was something like standing up a disability commission or thinking about the accessibility of trails. In Bloomington, Indiana, there's something called the Accessibility Decal Program, something I really would hope that that's something we could think about how to bring here to Rochester. So a way that city government or accessibility consultants, whatever that looks like, can go into, can work with private businesses and address all these things on this slide and figure out a plan for, okay, if it's not accessible now, what does it take to actually get there? And then the last one, even though it's a bigger city, I got to throw it on there, architectural access reviews from the city of San Francisco. So it is a requirement there for for city-owned or city-funded construction projects to go through reviews with their mayor's office on disability to actually review that plan in a meaningful way. So I will leave you with just saying that here are some great key resources that are in the state of Minnesota. Disability Hub MN, the Great Lakes ADA Center, SEMSIL, or the Southeast Minnesota Center for Independent Living, and then 2 different divisions that are part of the state government, the State Services for the Blind Division and the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Division that can be really great resources. They really helped me out. So I really want to uplift them as ones that anyone can go to, and I would highly recommend that you do. And in terms of the where to go from here, there are a lot of people who are already doing this work and who have already done this work here in the city of Rochester, and they have been doing so for decades. And I think that hopefully what I've shown can demonstrate that I know this is a long movement. I know that it takes a lot of time, but we absolutely we have to start somewhere. Certain organizations haven't started this work. And what it would actually take to start and move these things along are things that are genuinely achievable and within our purview. So, and any number of organizations, just to shout out a couple like Cardinal of Minnesota or Hiawatha Homes, Bear Creek, there's exercise abilities, max ability, possibilities, NOAA Rochester, Ability Building Community, the art. There's no shortage of really great organizations doing really great things here that I have certainly learned from, that I've been really grateful for their work on this. And charting a course toward becoming as accessible a community as possible is a collective effort and commitment. It will take all of us to do this meaningfully. And my door is always open to be able to talk about these things or to be able to connect people. I strongly believe the city should be a convener as much as we can be. And I know that this is something that will take a collective effort. And I'm excited to work with you and continue to work with all of you on this for what it can look like. So with that, I'll open it up to questions and feedback, and we can start with John.
Jacob, thank you very much. And thanks to Mayor Norton and the city. I mean, if you think about this, all starting with Bloomberg, and obviously we've had a long time commitment to accessibility in this community because of the nature of the community. But Jacob, you're a delight. I really appreciate the way you put this together. And I would hope too that you probably have made these services available to the chamber and others, so the business community can hear your message. Just a couple of questions. One, I want to, make sure that, and we've got people on this call that'll make sure of it, but I'm a believer in the community co-design process. Is this integral to that process? You don't have to answer that right now. Just make sure it is, because it's really, really, I think, important. And that's a great process that more people are using. I also wonder if, for example, you just see things every day. If this is part of your purview in your responsibility, that when I see what I believe to be immigrant visitors to the community in wheelchairs going around Silver Lake and they can't see the lake, but they can see the road really well, but you can't see the lake because the weeds are taller than George Thompson. George is very tall if you haven't met him. So, how do we do that? How do we make sure a Peace Plaza, not the one today, I'm not saying we have to redo it, but it wasn't built for accessibility. And so I just making sure it's wonderful to have you in this space to make sure that this lens, we're seeing through this lens in everything we do. We can't always change the past, but we can do a better job going forward. So I applaud your work. I'm glad you're doing it, and more people need to hear the message. Thank you.
course, and I really appreciate the question, and to quickly answer yours, and then I want to make sure that any other questions we can get to. It does take a long time, and one of the things that we're at least doing with the city is creating an accessibility change management plan with a number of community members and community leaders with disabilities, so that they can guide what it is that we're actually doing. And one of the things that I really care about, and because this is a 2-year-long fellowship, and whether I'm done with the City of Rochester by the end of next year, or whether I'm done in 10 years, right? I'll always care about strengthening the hand of my successor, and whatever that looks like, to make sure that they have it easier and they're in a better and more conducive environment to be able to address these things than what I entered into. And I think that what you brought up about making sure that people with disabilities are part of co-designs, I've had many conversations about that regardless of what some of those projects could look like, or someone would think that someone like, oh, we should get someone with a disability as part of this, that idea, that question should be something we're always asking, so that people in a number of different projects that use co-designs, frankly, as many as possible, do include that perspective and should. And that's something that Chow and I have talked about a lot.
Thank you, Jacob. One of the questions I've seen in the chat from Amanda, the disability checker sounds great. Where do you download that? And if you don't have the link now, I could definitely include it in a follow-up email afterwards.
When you said disability checker, what exactly were you referring to? Were you referring to like the presentation, like for Microsoft PowerPoint?
I think it was in the slide when you were sharing. Go ahead, Amanda. You're on mute, Amanda.
Thank you, Wafa. Yes, Jacob. I just wasn't aware of that feature with Microsoft Suite. So do you have to download like a plugin to use it, or is it?
I don't believe that you have to, and those accessibility features can be available really through anything with like Google or anything like that. I can share a link with Wafa because I would love to be able to get that out there, but even just to show you how the sausage is made on this, hopefully y'all are able to see this screen right now. Are y'all able to see what it looks like on the PowerPoint screen?
Yes.
So where my cursor is right there, Accessibility Investigate. Do you see that?
No, we're seeing the first slide, Jacob.
Oh, okay. Well, something that I can do then to make sure that I can get this out there is I'll make sure to share it with Wafa and a little bit more information so that it can get to you, because it is a godsend and it really, really helps.
And I think the last question we'll take, there is a question from Al in the chat. As far as interacting with people with wheelchair, I understand sensitivity with language. What about helping them access physical space, such as moving objects out of the way for them?
What my impression would be is that it would always depend upon what the person themselves would want, and that I wouldn't suggest that someone would assume that someone would automatically need help. So something I said something earlier on the slide is that, or on one of the slides in the past, is that you want to treat someone with recognition that they have their own agency, that they're a full and independent person, and to not automatically presume that they always need help. But that said, listen to them if they do need help, if there was something like a physical obstruction there, and to not hopefully just wait for when there is someone in a wheelchair who's going down that path, but to recognize that, oh, this could be an obstruction for someone who has mobility issues, whether they're a senior or whether they are someone who is a chair user. So that's what I would say to that, is that in the moment, defer to what the person is asking you and what they want, but hopefully in general, it should be on all of us to think about having the most accessible, clear paths imaginable. Because again, I think that that's a structural thing. So that's what I would say to that.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob. I appreciate your presentation, which we will share with everyone along with the YouTube link. before our next episode, which will be August 14th. Hopefully we get to see you all. We appreciate all the new faces that we saw today. If you are not included in the calendar invite for the equity series, feel free to just let us know in the chat now, and I'll make sure to include you. And then I want to give a shout out to Amanda from the Rochester Area Foundation. You keep us always connected, and you communicate some awesome upcoming events. Thank you so much for doing that. You also lead and manage the Rochester, Minnesota DEI practitioners community. It's a group on Facebook and on LinkedIn. And in the most recent email, I saw Amanda sharing these 3 upcoming events that they're happening this month in July, an opening of a Black-owned bookstore and community art hub this July 13th, a Women's Foundation event, July 24th, and then July 17th. Before that, there is a mobilization Olmsted Voices for Equity as the information session that's happening on the 17th of July. So if you're interested to receive this information, I'll volunteer this, Amanda. Just contact Amanda at the Rochester Area Foundation. She'll include you in a group of the email or on Facebook. But if you have any other questions for Jacob, feel free to email me or put them in the chat, and he will get back to you. And until we see you August 14th, I hope you enjoy your summer this month, and we'll see you next month. Thank you so much for being with us today.